Hey guys, welcome to Relatable. Happy Thursday. This episode is brought to you by our friends at Good Ranchers, American meat delivered right to your front door. That's goodranchers.com/Allie, goodranchers.com/Allie. Okay, today we are having a fascinating conversation with Pedro Gonzalez. He is the associate editor of Chronicles magazine. He is a writer. He does not describe himself as a journalist, and you will hear him say why. We are talking about Ukraine. Pedro has been very courageous in asking some questions that are deemed controversial, that you are not allowed to ask unless you want to be accused by the mainstream media of being a Putin puppet. And yet he's asking these questions. He's going to talk to us about the history of Ukraine. He's going to talk to us about Zelensky. We're going to talk about some things that a lot of people just don't want to talk about, don't want to mention, don't want to dig into, because as we will discuss, you're only supposed to have one position when it comes to Ukraine, and you cannot question the popular narrative or else you are unpatriotic. Now, as we've mentioned before, doesn't that line sound very familiar? If you're not for lockdowns, if you're not for Black Lives Matter burning down and looting cities, if you are not for kids having, mandatory vaccines and masks when they're 2 years old, then it's because you want people to die, because you hate America. If you don't think that young kids should be chemically castrated in the state of Texas, if you don't think that teachers should be talking to 5-year-olds about gender switching, it's because you want these people to die. It's because you're a horrible person. And that's the same kind of line that we are hearing when it comes to Ukraine. If you ask any questions at all about our involvement or the level of our involvement, you are accused of not caring about the Ukrainian people and of being pro-Putin. Of course, that's ridiculous. So we're just going to buck that narrative because, quite frankly, I don't believe that. I think, as we discussed either last week or a couple weeks ago, that you can hold common sense and compassion in your brain at the same time. We should be able to do that as thoughtful people, especially as Christians, right? We should be able to say that what's happening in Ukraine to the Ukrainian people who are caught in the crossfire here, that's really bad. We talked also about how there is a huge there's always been a human trafficking problem in Ukraine. Of course, there's a problem throughout the world, but especially in Ukraine, it's kind of a hotbed for it. Human trafficking, not just in the sense of sex trafficking, but also in the human trafficking of the corrupt surrogacy industry that is there. And so Ukraine has been a hotbed of corruption for a long time. If you just search on whatever your search engine is, Ukraine, corruption, New York Times, you will come up with a lot of articles detailing this. And so it's really nonsensical and it's really worrisome that we are supposed to now be unconditionally lionizing the leadership of a country that we've known for a long time is not actually pro-democracy. So we can understand that while also still saying, wow, we have so much compassion and so much sympathy for the Ukrainian people, and also a lot of sympathy for the Russian people who are not a part of this invasion and are also suffering because of sanctions that are actually hurting them and hurting us and not actually hurting the Putin regime. So let's be a little bit more thoughtful than what the mainstream media is telling us that we can be. Let's ask the questions that we are not allowed to ask, because we are under an obligation as people, as Christians, to try to find the truth. And I'm not saying that we're going to come up with everything that is objectively true in this conversation, but we're going into the territory that we are being told right now you're not supposed to go into. So I think you are going to find this conversation with Pedro very interesting and very enlightening. At the very least, it'll give you food for thought. And it should make us wonder, what is actually in Americans' interest? That's what we're supposed to be thinking about. That's what the leadership of any country is supposed to be thinking. What is in the interest of my people? Not the intelligence bureaucracy, not the military industrial complex, not just the leadership, not the bureaucracy in a country, but what is in the best interest of our people. And unfortunately, we've seen in a variety of ways, time and time again, that the people who lead this country, mostly unelected bureaucrats in a variety of agencies, don't really care about what is in the best interest of the American people. So knowing that and seeing that throughout the years, that should make us a little bit curious, if not entirely cynical, about what we hear from the media about anything, including when it comes to Russia and Ukraine. So We know Putin is a wicked dictator. We know that the Ukrainian people are suffering. We understand those things. Let's hold those things in our head while also asking some interesting questions. Can we do that? I think that we can. And Pedro is going to help us. So before we have that conversation with Pedro Gonzalez, just going to tell you what is coming up. So next week, we've got a few fun things that we're going to be talking about, important things. We are going to finally be covering that those 2 abortion bills that you guys have been asking me about, one in Colorado, one in Maryland. And I'm also going to share, I believe it's on Monday, maybe Tuesday. We haven't decided yet. This really interesting statistic that I found about maternal mortality rates in the United States. And it just kind of made me realize that so much policy, whether it's the policy of hospitals or whether it's government policy, not only are children laid on the altar of bad policy, as we've talked about many times, but so are women. So what does this mean for the Christian? How should we be looking at this stuff biblically? And we'll also look once again at the Supreme Court nominee and what she thinks about life and life inside the womb. And so we'll be talking about all of that on Monday or Tuesday. I think we are going to look at Ukraine also from another angle next week. I've also got a fun interview coming out with Phil and Al Robertson. So lots to look forward to. As always, feel free to send me what you want me to talk about next week. All right, before we get into the conversation, let me just tell you about our first sponsor for the day, and that is Cozy Earth. So if you appreciate the softness and comfort of truly luxury bedding, you're going to love today's sponsor, Cozy Earth. Cozy Earth is renowned for offering the softest and the most luxurious, environmentally friendly, and ethically produced bedding today. I love Cozy Earth. I love the sheets that they sent us. They are amazing, but I also love their loungewear. It truly is so soft. I wear it all the time. Cozy Earth sheets are made from the finest luxury materials, including soft viscose from highly sustainable bamboo, and their bedding is not only super soft, lightweight, and breathable, but temperature regulating too, so you sleep at the perfect temperature year round. They also offer a 100-night sleep trial, which means you have up to 100 nights to sleep on it, wash it, try it out. So save 35% on Cozy Earth when you go to cozyearth.com/Allie and enter code Allie at checkout. Save 35% now. That's cozyearth.com/Allie, cozyearth.com/Allie. Okay, now without further ado, here is Pedro Gonzalez. Pedro, thanks so much for joining us. Can you first tell us who you are and what you do?
Yeah, so I'm the associate editor at Chronicles magazine, and I am a writer because I don't like the term journalist, because I don't like journalists. So,
Oh, can you unpack that for us just a little bit? I'm sure a lot of people
yeah,
have the same sentiments.
it's a weird place to be in because this is what I do, right? This is what I do for a living. It's my only job, but there's also this kind of conflicted feeling I have because when you look around, it really seems like a lot of journalists are not actually, truth tellers or how they like to describe themselves. They're actually just kind of repeating whatever, whether it is the people that own their publications, or right now in the context of Ukraine and Russia, it's whatever the Pentagon is saying.
Right.
Or right now, you've got journalists from MSNBC and CNN basically demanding, not asking NATO questions like, would it be worth getting into a nuclear war with Russia over Ukraine? I mean, would that make sense for the world? Instead, you've got journalists asking, would it be morally acceptable for NATO to stand by and do nothing? I mean,
Right.
this is, again, these are journalists who are supposed to be asking tough questions, but instead they're kind of browbeating other people into doing what they want. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, it's a weird position for people like me to be in because I know I'm not alone in this. Like guys like Glenn Greenwald, who's obviously more on the political left, but he feels the same way, that a lot of journalists, especially in the mainstream, are kind of just, for lack of a better word, bootlickers of one variety or another.
Yeah, I think the journalist that you were just describing is Andrea Mitchell from NBC.
Yeah.
I think that she's the one that recently asked that kind of just strange question. And we're used to this, especially over the past few years. We've seen a lot of journalists become sycophants for one side and really just kind of unashamedly that whole activist journalist movement that has really become mainstream. And it really, I think it boils down to, well, there are a lot of different factors. The ones that you just listed are there for sure. But I think in the simplest terms, like it's hard to write objectively about your friends. And journalists have become friends with these Democrat politicians. They've become friends with the people in our intelligence bureaucracy. It's really hard to distance yourself when you have formed these relationships, and where these relationships are a little quid pro quo, and you feel like you've got a little bit of power, a little bit of maybe insulation from criticism or whatever it is. If you kind of cozy up to the people in power, it's really difficult. It takes more integrity than most journalists have in this country to distance yourself from your friends and be able to write about things objectively. Do you think that's part of it?
Yeah, that's certainly part of it. It's access, and you don't, like you
Mm,
said, you don't want to fear losing access by doing your job a little too well. And I
true.
think that's certainly a huge aspect of it. But then there's also this ideological component to it, where again, journalists like to describe themselves, and I don't lie about this. Like I have my prejudices. I am biased, in fact, toward the American interests, but I don't hide it. I guess the issue is that you have so many journalists who do hide it. They like to cast themselves as just objective truth tellers. They're not picking a side, but they are. It's
Yeah.
obvious they are when they ask questions like that. Don't we have a moral responsibility to intervene and possibly trigger World War III? That's not an unbiased question.
Right. It's a
That's
leading
all of these
question.
questions are loaded, right? Yeah.
Right.
And so I think that's a huge part of it is, on the one hand, yes, there is this sycophancy, this desire for access, which the access part to a degree is understandable, but when it's informing all of your work, it obviously becomes a problem, because you do need to maintain good relations with some people to do your job, but again, there's a limit to what that looks like, right? And then on the other hand, it's this ideological component that I've just been referring to as liberal internationalism, that we have a kind of, or as Andrea Mitchell said, we have a moral obligation to invade the world or intervene, to put it euphemistically, to intervene everywhere and invite the world. So basically, I mean, it's not a coincidence that many of the same people that are saying that we must intervene in Ukraine are also the same ones that you'll hear saying that we have an obligation, we have a moral duty to accept everyone who comes to our border illegally
Mm-hmm.
or not. Uh, we have a moral duty to allow them into the country. It's often the same people.
Yeah. Can you help me kind of understand? Because there are these same people who are saying that we have a moral obligation to intervene. Uniquely in Ukraine, they don't seem to think that in every single area of the world, which is interesting. These are some of the same people, though, that say that they are anti imperialism, and they kind of demonize the history of the United States by saying it's just been an evil imperialist force for wickedness and destruction throughout our history, throughout the world. They would say that they are against that, but at the same time, they are pushing for a form of imperialism, and also they don't care about China's imperialism in different parts of the world. So can you help me understand that? Is that just hypocrisy, like they don't understand that they are contradicting themselves, or is it more complex than what I'm explaining?
I think hypocrisy is certainly a factor, but then I think that hypocrisy might entail I don't know, it's difficult, right? Because you have to wonder, if is there any self-awareness here? Part of me thinks that to be a hypocrite, a person has to be aware of the contradictions,
Mm,
but the fact that they're not aware of them or they don't even recognize them, I think, is what makes this more complicated. And so, I mean, this gets into the history of Ukraine, right? Because, like you said, we like to denounce imperialism in the United States a lot. In recent times, we like to demonize our own history now in schools, and we have engaged in this systematic project of basically deconstructing America and kind of recasting it as an evil empire. But the same people are also, like you said, the ones saying that we actually have a responsibility to intervene in places like Ukraine. Um, and when you go back and look at how we got here, you kind of see this. I will just call it hypocrisy. You can see this hypocrisy at play. That basically the thing that's being left out of this entire discussion is that the West, and specifically Western liberal interventionists, have. I mean, I've been putting this very bluntly. These people have blood on their hands.
Mm.
Yes, Putin invaded Ukraine in February. There's no disputing that. Russia is going to have to answer for what's happening. Civilians are being killed in this. Uh, all of these things are obvious and tragic. But what's not obvious, and I would even say is just as tragic, is the fact that the architects of this crisis have not been held accountable. Right now, they're doing a great job of reinventing themselves as the heroes of the moment. And they're even going so far as saying that if you dare question, if you even ask that question, like, for example, Tucker Carlson, did Washington, D.C. have a hand in this crisis? If you ask that question, you're a traitor.
Yeah.
According to Hillary Clinton and Mitt Romney and other smart people
So
like Adam
that's
Kinzinger.
who you're talking about. When you're talking about the architects, who are you talking about, and why do you say that they're the architects?
Oh boy, Ukraine is. I can't think of an analog for it because there are so many different competing factors
Yeah.
and players from basically DC ideologues to cynics at like the Clinton Foundation to Ukrainian and Russian oligarchs. It's so. Well, we can just say this for certain, and I'll get into like a few key figures, but we can say this for certain. Ukraine is not a battle for democracy. There is an actual nationalist sentiment in Ukraine, and there are people in Ukraine who want democracy, namely the civilians who are really caught in the crossfire. But in terms of like geopolitics, this is not a battle for democracy. It's a battle between like competing interest groups that are obviously just reframing it as a battle for democracy because democracy is a nice buzzword. Who could disagree with democracy, right? Who could be against liberal democracy?
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, we can focus on one set of players and to kind of help understand why this is not actually, like I said, a battle for liberal democracy,
Yeah.
but instead it's a kind of like hive of villainy and intrigue.
Yeah.
And so one example that is kind of illustrative of the relationship on the one hand between the US government, Ukrainian oligarchs, and on the other hand, NGOs. This is a huge thing in Ukraine, is this relationship between the Clinton Foundation and a Ukrainian oligarch named Viktor Pinchuk. And cut me off at any time.
Go for it.
So the Wall Street Journal published an article in 2015, and they looked at individual donations made by foreign donors to the Clinton Foundation between the 90s and running up to 2014. Because the article was published in 2015, so that's the window they had to work with. And what they found is that the top source of donations of more than $50,000 or more to the Clinton Foundation by foreign contributors actually came from Ukraine. Interesting, right? And one of these key figures is, like I said, a guy named Viktor Pinchuk. So how does Viktor Pinchuk end up giving almost $10 million to the Clinton Foundation? Well, he was introduced to Bill Clinton by a registered lobbyist for Viktor Pinchuk named Doug Schoen, who actually worked as a pollster for both Bill and Hillary Clinton. So Pinchuk is introduced to Bill Clinton by Doug Schoen in 2006. By 2007, Bill Clinton is doing speaking events at initiatives that are run by Viktor Pinchuk. And by 2008, you have a significant amount of money that's moving between Viktor Pinchuk and Clinton NGOs. And this relationship overlaps, but this relationship between the Ukrainian oligarch and the Clinton Foundation overlaps with Hillary Clinton's time at the State Department. Doug Schoen has denied that him being a registered lobbyist for Pinchuk had anything to do with the relationship between the Clinton Foundation, Hillary Clinton, and Bill Clinton, of course, because he has to. But this is, again, really illustrative of the kind of dealing that you have going on in this country, which kind of helps explain why there is this incredible, like, powerful border. I mean, it's hysterical reaction to the threat of Ukraine kind of being taken out of the orbit of DC and its allies. We can move on, or we can stay here.
Yeah, I think Well, I'll just kind of enter, I think, some questions that the common person has. I don't consider myself a foreign policy expert, but of course I pay attention, and a lot of people do. And I think some questions that people have, but they're scared to ask because we're being told by the very journalist that we were just referencing that you can't have common sense and compassion at the same time, that the two are mutually exclusive. So if you ask questions about our motivations and the level of intervention in Ukraine, that means you don't care about the Ukrainians dying. That means, as you mentioned earlier, that you're a Putin puppet, that you're pro-Russia, whatever. But I think most people actually do hold common sense and compassion at the same time. I think most people do say, you know what's happening there is really bad. Obviously, don't support Putin, and we're really sad for what's happening in Ukraine. The stories coming out of there of women and children being trafficked, it's all just awful, and we can be sad about that. And also ask at the same time, hang on, like, why are we so hyper-focused on this? Why are the same people that believe, as you mentioned earlier, that we have a moral obligation to accept all people, that we basically have no sovereignty as a country, we have no borders, why are they so hyper-focused on Ukraine's borders? Like, the people who don't care about democracy at all here, they say that they care so much about democracy in Ukraine. Isn't that a little odd? Isn't it a little odd how they are doing the same thing that they did with BLM. They're doing the same thing that they did with lockdowns, that if you disagree with them, it's because you want people to die. The same thing that they do with, transitioning kids. If you don't agree with that, it's because you want kids to die by suicide. They do this, and they're doing this with Ukraine. And so the question I think that most people have is, why? And I know that you kind of started to answer that, especially with the people who have, actual monetary interest, financial interest there. But what is the interest of people like Mitt Romney? What is the interest of people like Adam Kinzinger? These Republicans who want so badly for us to intervene and maybe start World War III. Why? I just can't understand the why behind it.
Well, I think let's say that these people are true believers. They're dyed-in-the-wool ideologues. I think that you'll eventually go crazy trying to understand ideologues because, ideology is a kind of self-contained thing. You can't really, we have this saying, right, or conservatives have this saying, facts don't care about your feelings. Well, with ideologues, feelings always trump facts. And so you can show them, for example, that Washington led sanctions against Iraq for its invasion of Kuwait in the early 90s, that those sanctions resulted, and again, I say Washington because obviously the American people, if they knew what happens as a result of this stuff, they wouldn't want anything to do with it. But these sanctions led by the United States government resulted in up to 500,000 children in Iraq starving and dying. Again, that's the high end. And I think to give you some insight into how unrepentant ideologues are, true believers, Madeleine Albright, who recently passed away, when she was asked by 60 Minutes if she thought, and again, that number is disputed. Like on the high end, it's 500,000, but some people say it's half that. What's indisputable is that a lot of children ended up starving to death as a direct result of the sanctions imposed by Washington, D.C., and that they spearheaded. So when presented with the figure 500,000 by, I think it was 60 Minutes, during an interview with 60 Minutes, she was asked, was it worth it? And Madeleine Albright said it was. It was worth it.
Wow.
There's no, again, and it's important to understand that these are the same people that are telling you we have a moral obligation to intervene because we did it in Kuwait and it was worth it. That's insane. What good, decent American would say, yeah, that was worth it?
Yeah.
Americans have good, and I think this is one of the good things about conservatism is that there's like a deep skepticism toward government, and for good reason, because these are the people that are creating policy, the ones that'll just look you in the face and say, yeah, it was up to 500,000 children starving to death. Yeah, that was worth it.
Yeah.
No, it wasn't.
Yeah.
And I'm a father. I'm a new father. I have a toddler and a few month old.
Me too. We're in the same boat, in the same stage. Yep.
Yeah. So no, when I hear people talk like that, it was worth it. Obviously what Iraq did was bad, but no, making it worse, to satisfy your ideology of liberal internationalism, it's not worth it.
Okay, quick break to tell you about Annie's Kit Clubs. March is National Craft Month, which means that you only have a little bit longer to celebrate by taking advantage of Annie's Kit Club's best deal ever. So if you don't know the deal with Annie's Kit Clubs, they send you a new kit every month with all the materials and the directions that you need to make a project. They've got tons of different kinds of kit clubs. They have 25 to be exact. They've got the Creative Woman's Kit Club and lots of different things that come with that. And then they've got 3 different types of kids kit clubs for, I think, about 7 to 12-year-olds. They've got the Woodworkers Kit Club. They've got the Genius Box. They've got the Creative Girls Club. So they've got all types of really fun things. They've got projects that they send you to your front door every month. It's a great way to be productive, to work with your hands, to exercise your creativity. It's so much better than just kind of, allowing our minds to atrophy as we scroll through social media or watch Netflix or something like that. A much better way to spend your time. Right now, you can get this amazing discount. You can find the right subscription for you, and then you can get up to 100% off of your first month of any club plus shipping. All subscriptions are month to month. You can cancel at any time. AnniesKitClubs.com/Allie. Get your first kit for up to 100% off. That's AnniesKitClubs.com/Allie. Do you distinguish, because I saw this distinction earlier and maybe you don't, do you distinguish between internationalism and globalism? And if you do, why?
I think they're related. I mean, it's ultimately this view of, well, I would say that the difference is that we're talking about globalism. We're in a sense, we're talking about just the internationalization of the division of labor. We're all now kind of interdependent on each other, right? Which is obviously, on the one hand, you get like nice wine and cheese from around the world, but on the other hand, you send your factories to China and Mexico and stuff like that. So that's kind of globalism, right? Again, the internationalization, division of labor, and global interdependency. I would say that the liberal internationalist, or the pejorative form is liberal interventionist, which is the one I most commonly use. Liberal interventionists, on the one hand, they think that the kind of global interdependence is a good thing, but they think that the United States and specifically Washington should be kind of leading it. That everyone should be kind of bowing to us, and that NATO is kind of just an instrument for our interests and not actually it's a military alliance, but it's ultimately led by DC, and it's kind of just whatever we want it to be and whatever we want to use it for. So I think that's the difference, is that liberal interventionists just think that DC should be kind of leading the show. And again, as conservatives, or people on the right, I actually don't use the term conservative for myself, but a lot of people still just, obviously do. It's a different discussion, but the point is that I think it's important for conservatives to understand, who are deeply patriotic, to not conflate being patriotic with kind of like just going along with whatever Washington thinks is right.
Right.
Because I think that's one of the reasons why the current crisis is kind of horrifying, is because certain people, conservative pundits, Republican politicians, have done a really good job of kind of wedding basically what DC wants, which is not what is best for the American people, with these notions of American exceptionalism. That basically it's kind of with us or against us all over again. And if you're critical of what DC wants, of what these liberal internationalists wants, well, then it must mean that you hate America. You're like a Putin stooge or a useful idiot or something. It's Anne Applebaum recently used that term to describe people like Tucker Carlson, useful idiot, because he's, again, asking these questions like, should we start World War III over Ukraine? Like, would that save lives or result in more casualties? Well, even if you ask that, you're not patriotic. And it's not just people like Anne Applebaum at The Atlantic. It's a lot of conservative pundits, and it's a lot of Republican politicians.
Yeah, it's very bizarre actually watching Fox News going from Tucker Carlson's show where he's asking those questions and then going through the next programming where those questions aren't asked at all. It is, I mean, I don't think people realize, and I know
Yeah.
you don't call yourself a conservative, but how many different perspectives there are on this just on the right
Yes.
alone, or on the non-left at least. I saw this
Yeah.
really interesting study, and it was just it was in Canada. It wasn't in the United States, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was similar here, that
Yeah.
the more vaccines you have, the more
Yes.
likely you are to support more intervention between Russia and
Yes.
Ukraine. I mean, that's crazy. That tells you
Yeah.
something about people's willingness, their almost just desire, their craving to find a narrative, to find a different way to show that they're virtuous, to show that they're patriotic, which a lot of these people truly like hate the countries where they live. And so it's funny that
Right.
they care about seeming patriotic. But man, shouldn't that tell us something
Right.
about the messengers, the message itself, and the importance in asking the questions that are being demonized right now?
Yeah. No, yeah, it's funny because a lot of us were kind of joking about this, right? That it's the new thing. And that before Ukraine, before our stand with Ukraine and like hashtag stand with Ukraine, it was vaccines and kind of just doing whatever people like Fauci said. And before that, it was BLM. And I mean, it ended up being, empirically true that basically the
Yeah.
more willing you were to go along with the vaccine regime, the more likely, literally, the more vaccines you have, the more likely you are to support Ukraine. It's actually terrifying in a way,
Yeah,
because
it
you
is.
wonder, like, jokingly, like, is it something in the vaccine, or is this like, or is it like a psychological thing that that I mean, in a sense, that's setting aside some horrific dystopian thing that there's something in the drug. The easiest explanation is really just that. People are moving from one kind of way of identifying to another. So
Yeah.
before you showed people that you were virtuous by, putting a black square in your Instagram to show that you
Hmm.
stood with BLM, and then it was, uh, you know, bragging about how you're vaxxed and boosted,
Hmm.
and now it's putting the Ukrainian flag in your bio and doing the hashtag Stand with Ukraine. So I think it's a desire to belong to groups, and
Mm.
which is human, and we're all guilty of this. We all identify with things, but there obviously there's a line that people should be aware of, which is
Yeah.
rushing into these fads that have tremendous consequences for society or entire civilizations. Like support for BLM
Yeah.
was basically whether people want to admit it or not, like supporting BLM was a way to look away from what BLM was actually doing, which was on the
Hmm.
one hand just stealing people's donations, and you can look at the organizers of BLM, and like they're all like fat happy cats now with like mansions and stuff.
Yeah. After
So on the one
destroying
hand,
poor communities with
right,
predominantly minority Americans in them, it's
yeah,
been exclusively a
yeah,
destructive force and a
yes,
force for
right.
injustice. And yeah, there's no reckoning about that. But I think
But
you go ahead. Go ahead.
I was going to say, but if you supported BLM, you didn't actually have to reckon with any of the things that you just described
Yeah,
because you were on the
exactly.
right side of history.
Exactly. And no one ever tried to hold you. No one ever gets held accountable for getting it wrong in the beginning, as long as
Yeah,
the position that you took in the beginning was what, I don't even know if it's liberal, whatever it is, whatever the regime narrative was, as long as you took that position, then you were considered a good leader. All of the Democratic governors who, inflicted the harshest, most draconian policies as possible. It doesn't matter that people maybe died of isolation-induced depression and suicide. It doesn't matter that alcoholism went up. It doesn't matter that our mental health is deteriorating because of that. It doesn't matter that people's business closed. Like, you're still considered a good leader if you inflicted those kinds of policies. You're still considered a good person if you posted the black square. You're still considered a good person if you go along with whatever the narrative is. And I think you touched on something about human nature that is really important and profound that I don't want to gloss over, is that everyone wants to be a part of something. Yes, that's part of human nature. But I think the sad thing is that because everyone wants to be a part of something, and because we've become such a disjointed hyper individualistic society. I mean, the family has broken down, communities have broken down, church attendance is less than it was. We don't really have those communities and those close
Yeah.
relationships that we seek, and we're more godless than ever before. People are seeking identification with groups that aren't really real. Like, it's not real. The Black
Yeah.
Square community is not a community. The Ukrainian flag in my bio, community is not a real community. It's all
Yeah.
fake. It's almost like the Metaverse community. It's not real, which is really, really sad.
Yeah. You're already, it feels like we're already living in the metaverse because of
Kind of.
how quickly people can be kind of programmed into going from supporting BLM to Fauci to Zelensky in Ukraine. Yeah, it is. I mean, that's a huge part of it. And I think the conservatives kind of already understand this, or I should say Christians already understand this, because of there's, the saying that people have a God-shaped hole in their hearts.
Mm-hmm.
It's basically the same thing.
Yeah.
People have a community-shaped hole in their hearts.
Yeah.
And so it's easy to move from one thing to another and look around you and see that you're part of a group that has solidarity for the current thing, and then for the time being shaping your whole identity around that
Right.
that social community until the next thing.
Yeah.
But
It's very
again,
odd. Well,
right.
tell me a
But
little bit about you. You mentioned Zelensky, and I've heard you talk about this before in other interviews, but tell us about Zelensky, because he is almost universally lionized, maybe for a good reason, but maybe not. Like, who really is he, and should we be, lauding him as a hero?
Well, I've likened him to Fauci in the sense that he's a kind of media creation, because until recently, Zelensky was actually taking a lot of heat because he had campaigned as an anti-corruption president. But surprise, he ended up being just as corrupt as pretty much all of his predecessors. So, I mean, this was a big deal literally until last year.
How
There
was
was
he corrupt? He was like jailing dissidents, basically, right?
I mean, there's that stuff, but then also just the fact that he's connected to Ukrainian oligarchs who and specifically one named Ihor Kolomoisky. I'll get into that, but the point is that within the last year, an investigative effort culminating in the Pandora Papers looked at the secret offshore holdings of more than 300 politicians and public officials across more than 90 nations. And what they found is that the country that had the greatest number of politicians and public officials hiding these secret holdings somewhere was actually in Ukraine. The number two was actually Russia.
Wow.
So in other words, you have more of this kind of like international financial crime activity that's happening in Ukraine than a lot of other countries, and according to the Pandora Papers, again, even more so than Russia, in a certain sense. And this was actually a huge deal for Ukraine, and specifically Zelensky, because again, he had campaigned as an anti-corruption president, and here he's being outed as basically not much, not being much different from his predecessors, Petro Poroshenko or Viktor Yanukovych, who was ousted by a U.S. State Department-backed color revolution in 2014 for being. He was characterized as kind of like a pro-Russian puppet. I mean, The Economist, I think, accurately described him as more of like a neutralist who kind of milked both sides. But then since him, supposedly Ukraine was like on track for becoming an actual democracy.
Yeah.
That's up for debate. But I think, yeah, if you want to understand Zelensky, you have to look at a particular oligarch named Ihor Kolomoisky. So who is Kolomoisky? Wow, this guy is he's like a larger than life figure. In some ways, you kind of like admire how Machiavellian he is, but in other ways, when you accept that Kolomoisky is like the real power behind Zelensky, you also accept that Zelensky is not really in control. And so going back to let's see, because we kind of have to go back almost to 2013, but I think a good starting point is this $2 billion, what do we call it, looting of IMF money that happens in the mid 2000s. So up until 2016, Kolomoisky was the co-owner. He was the co-founder, and then up until 2016, he was the co-owner of Privat Bank, one of the biggest banks in Ukraine. In 2016, it was nationalized. And basically, he had taken about $2 billion of emergency IMF aid money and embezzled that, basically stole it through the Privat Bank and the Privat group of companies. But the United States looked the other way because Kolomoisky was kind of like he was useful to us in a sense, and specifically. We needed to kind of have oligarchs that we could work with, and Kolomoisky was one of them. And so, I'm sorry, I'm paraphrasing a lot here, but basically, in order to get off of, because this guy was so corrupt that the United States actually put him on a visa ban list,
Wow.
right? So how does Kolomoisky get off the visa ban list? Well, he attempts to take control of a Ukrainian company that is in charge of most of the oil pipelines in the country. And this is a direct threat to then Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko. And so basically, they come up with a deal to get Kolomoisky off of Poroshenko's back. Part of that deal involves taking basically having Poroshenko work with his friends in the United States, specifically a woman named Victoria Nuland, who has worked in every administration since Bill Clinton. She worked under Bill Clinton, under George H.W. Bush. She was instrumental. Not George H.W., I'm sorry, George W. Bush. She worked under Obama, and she's actually working under Biden right now. But so Kolomoisky goes and tells Poroshenko, talk to your allies in the United States and tell them to get me off the visa ban list so I can resume, traveling into the United States and more importantly, doing business there. And it actually works. Poroshenko manages to get Kolomoisky off the visa ban list, and Kolomoisky agrees to basically not taking over Ukraine's oil operations. But that's not the end of the story for Kolomoisky. He basically decides that he's going to undermine Poroshenko. So how does he do that? Well, he takes Zelensky, who is, remember he's a comedian, he's an actor, and he creates a show called Servant of the People, and he puts it on his network. And some people have basically characterized it.
I did not know the background. I mean, I knew he was a comedian and that he played a president in a show, but I didn't know the background. Wow. Yeah,
I'm sorry. I'm like trying to paraphrase.
No, that's okay. No, it's really interesting.
So much here.
Yeah,
it is. So some people have basically likened this to kind of like campaigning by another name, because on this show, Zelensky is a kind of like anti-corruption leader of Ukraine, and when he actually ended up becoming president of Ukraine, he basically tried to become the character that he had played in this show that was hosted on a network owned by Kolomoisky. And so when asked a few years ago, basically whether Ukraine could do without, basically when it emerged that Ukraine is just as corrupt as it has always been, Kolomoisky was interviewed by the Washington Post, and he was asked, like, well, look, do you think that if Zelensky had to choose between basically you or the IMF, basically international aid, who would he go with? Or he said, who do you think would win? Like international aid agencies or you? And Kolomoisky said, I would.
Wow.
I mean, that kind of tells you that, Zelensky, although I think he probably has tried to do some good in Ukraine and has actually tried to advocate to a certain degree anti-corruption stuff, at the end of the day, he's a creation of Kolomoisky, literally a creation of the media. But all of this has been whitewashed. We haven't discussed it whatsoever because we seem to have an interest in Ukraine, or a wide array of interests in Ukraine. And so now Zelensky is kind of just above reproach. We're not allowed to ask these questions. We're not allowed to look into this vast network of corruption. Kolomoisky also has a controlling stake in Burisma.
I was about to ask, where does Hunter Biden come into all this?
Yeah,
I know we don't have to get into all of it, but
yeah, no, it's actually incredible because precisely because we don't talk about this.
Yeah.
So Hunter Biden actually ended up this relationship between Hunter Biden and Burisma actually started in April 2014, right after this U.S. State Department backed coup went into effect in Ukraine. So I mean, I'm not an expert on the Hunter Biden Burisma story, but basically, it's actually not unusual at all. Like, this is just how Ukraine is. Like, it's just tit for tat. Ukrainian oligarchs and Ukrainian business interests doing favors for basically for DC players,
right.
And they get something out of it. And in the case of Kolomoisky, he managed to get himself off the visa ban list. But then in 2021, the State Department, Anthony Blinken, actually redesignated him as someone who was banned from entering the United States.
Wow.
But this is Zelensky's #1 backer, and we're not asking any of these questions.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, you could go crazy trying to like connect all the dots and going down all the different rabbit holes. Yeah. But I think the color revolution is probably the most fascinating thing because Ukraine was really kind of ground zero for using social media and NGOs and so-called civil society institutions to affect regime change. I mean, it had happened before. We'd seen it in the Arab Spring, but to the degree that it happened in Ukraine, I think it was. I mean, there's a reason it's called the Facebook Revolution and the journalist uprising.
Right. I think a lot of people probably don't know that. That's another conversation for another day. I'm sure we could spend a lot of time talking about that. All right, guys, last sponsor of the day, and I absolutely love this sponsor. This company is Dell Natural Cosmetics. Dell Natural Cosmetics is a family-run, holistic, handcrafted, and toxin-free cosmetic company where all of their products are made in the United States. I started following them several months ago, sometime last year, just because I liked how their products looked, and so I started trying their products, and I just loved it so much that I actually wanted them. We talked before. Usually, it's an advertiser reaches out to the company they want to advertise, but I talked to them first because I wanted so badly to advertise for this company. That's how much I love them. I love their face wash. I love their makeup. I love their moisturizer. I use it every single day. I seriously recommend them because I think that my skin is healthier than ever because of these products. I don't even use face wash or soap anymore on my face. I only use their cleansing oil. And it doesn't make your face oily, at least not for me, and it doesn't make you break out or anything like that. I just feel like my face is reacting so much better to their products because they are holistic. It's so much better than what I was using before. And so I really, really recommend you try them out. They've also got awesome makeup too. They're just a great family-owned company. They've been so incredibly kind to me, so you can feel good about where your dollars are going. Go to AdeleNaturalCosmetics.com, enter the promo code Allie for 25% off your first order. That's AdeleNaturalCosmetics.com, promo code Allie, AdeleNaturalCosmetics.com. Just really quickly, something that I want to get your thoughts on. You mentioned Tori Newland, and she admitted, for people who don't know, I'm sure people did hear about this in an exchange with Marco Rubio a couple weeks ago. She admitted that there are biolabs in Ukraine and that it would be bad if Russia had access to those biolabs. But at the same time, we're hearing, well, no, they're nothing. It's insignificant. And yet, if Russia got control of them, it would be a problem. To me, it needs to be one or the other. Tulsi Gabbard, she put a video out saying, look, there are biolabs there. We're funding these biolabs, and it's risky research that's going on there. And then Mitt Romney, the ideologue one that we mentioned earlier, said this is Russian propaganda. But it's actually factually accurate what she says. She said that there are 25 to 30 U.S. funded biolabs in Ukraine. According to the U.S. government, these biolabs are conducting research on dangerous pathogens. So just what's your take on that? What's the truth about all that? Honestly, I thought that was a conspiracy theory in the beginning, and I was kind of stunned to figure out that there's truth to it.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's what we do know, and I really appreciate Tulsi because her bottom line is look, there are labs there. It's just indisputable.
Yeah.
And the talking point that our only real involvement in these labs has been to basically kind of dismantle like Soviet era systems and kind of like we're not doing any kind of research and development there. Um, Tulsi has just pointed out, like, look, that's just not true. Like, we've been investing money in research and development in these biolabs in Ukraine. They're there. We don't necessarily know exactly what's going on. We just know that there are dangerous pathogens in these biolabs, that we've invested millions of dollars in R&D there, and that's the extent of what we know. Which is why that whole exchange between Victoria Nuland and Marco Rubio was, for a lot of people, alarming, because up until that point, basically the line was that we're not doing any kind of research there.
Right.
Like, it's just absurd to suggest that we are. And then you get that interview, and Rubio asks, it was basically a softball question, right? And all she had to say was no, but she didn't. She didn't say that we weren't, experimenting with dangerous stuff there, doing research and development with dangerous stuff. She said that there is, and it would be bad if there. She kind of, it was a beat around the bush answer, but more importantly, she said it would be bad if the Russians got their hands on it. And then Marco Rubio's follow up is, well, any suggestion that the United States would do something like a false flag is just Russian misinformation, right? And then that kind of ended up becoming the talking point for the media.
Weird. What an interesting way to ask that question.
Yeah, because it seemed like Rubio was expecting her to just say no and kind of deny it. But then when she didn't, he was like, well, anything to the contrary is Russian misinformation, right? And this gets into the question of, like, would the United States government ever lie to us? Which is yes.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. So I think that, the Biolab story it's only alarming in the sense that right now you're hearing again and again that the red line for NATO intervention is the use of chemical weapons.
Yeah.
That's alarming because we apparently do have things like chemical weapons in Ukraine.
Yeah.
It's alarming because it's impossible not to speculate, like, would basically Ukrainian forces attempt to do something with that stuff and make it seem as if Russia did it in order to get us involved. Like, we've seen examples of this.
About that.
Right. Well, we've seen examples of this debate. This is extremely controversial. There's still tons of debate over it, but the question of whether or not Assad used chemical weapons in Syria. On the one hand, you have people that say that he did, and on the other hand, you have people that are saying that, like, actually it was rebels that used chemical weapons and then attempted to put it on the Assad regime in order to spark international outrage. And just the fact that argument exists and that debate is still ongoing should inform what's happening right now in Ukraine, because again, it is extremely concerning that we're drawing the red line at chemical weapons when we've established that there are, in fact, chemical weapons in Ukraine.
Right.
It's alarming for a number of reasons. The most obvious one is that it would trigger basically World War III, and on the other one, the only thing that you could do in the event that chemical weapons are used in Ukraine, and everyone is saying it's Russia, is saying, well, how do we know it wasn't Ukraine that used them? And then attempted to peg them on Russia, right, to get us involved. That is an extremely difficult position to find yourself in, because then you start sounding like you're just repeating, like, whatever the Kremlin is saying. But on the other hand, we actually have seen Ukraine lie about things that Russia's doing. Like, for example, on more than one occasion, Zelensky and his officials have claimed that Russia was deliberately trying to blow up nuclear facilities. Not like there's fighting nearby. This is cause for concern. It was like Zelensky used the term nuclear terrorism and was suggesting that Russia was deliberately trying to destroy nuclear facilities, which is not true. Like, Reuters, incredibly, Reuters and the Associated Press actually did on-the-ground interviews with people at the plant who, on the one hand, confirmed that, like, there is no imminent, yes, this unfortunately there is fighting going around nuclear facilities, but like, it's under control. The fires are under control. The facilities are basically safe. And at the same time that you have these officials on the ground saying that, like basically dismissing the idea that Russia is actively trying to detonate like a nuclear power plant or something like that. Zelensky and officials are saying like Russia is engaging in nuclear terrorism and we need to close the skies over Ukraine right now. Every time that they can, they've used or played up some event in order to get us involved.
Yeah.
And I think that one was actually I mean, people have already forgotten about this, but for a while, that was actually the scariest moment that we had. It's a nuclear power plant. I think it's actually the biggest one in Europe. It's I'm not even going to try to pronounce the name of the town that it's in, but that plant became kind of like the rallying point for Zelensky and his officials, and for a lot of journalists that like, okay, Russia is trying to blow up the biggest nuclear facility in Europe. We need to close the skies over Ukraine, which would entail shooting down Russian aircraft and destroying Russian anti-air systems on the ground. Right. In other words, a full-scale intervention by NATO, bringing the United States into direct conflict with Russia. That is what Ukraine tried to trick us into doing already. Why wouldn't they do it again with something like chemical weapons?
Yeah.
It's not insane to say that we should be extremely skeptical of anything like this that comes out of Ukraine, because it's in their interest to get us involved. In a sense, it's rational to get us involved. Yeah. It's catastrophic and would get tons of people killed, but it's understandable that they would do that kind of stuff to bring us into the conflict. So that's why,
right.
Yeah.
Ukraine seeks its own interests better than the United States is looking after its own interests.
Yes.
I mean, for sure, whether we agree with the tactics or not. And maybe we give the Biden administration a little credit. I don't know if you agree with this, but I did hear Jen Psaki when she was asked by a journalist, like, why don't we do a no-fly zone? I honestly think a lot of people don't know what a no-fly zone entails. There's this very popular Instagram influencer who says that she's unbiased, but she definitely leans to the left, and so does her audience. She asked people, what do you think we should do in Ukraine? Almost every comment said, no fly zone. We need to go in there. We need to intervene. I don't think people even understand the level of casualties that we would have and what that actually means. But anyway, back to the Biden administration, Jen Psaki said that. She said, look, we're basically declaring war if we do a no-fly zone. And they haven't intervened as much as Republicans and Democrats have asked them to, as much as the media has asked them to. Do you think they'll hold the line on that?
This is where it gets, again, this is one of the things that you can go crazy thinking about. But I think Biden personally is kind of dovish, and I think he's genuinely afraid of a full-scale confrontation with Russia.
Which is good. That's one of the most sanest thoughts that he probably has.
Yes. It's one of the only redeeming qualities of Biden is that I think he's deeply afraid of an actual U.S.-led war against Russia for good reason. Russia's only real recourse, if that happens, is the use of its tactical nuclear arsenal, which, again, I think is something that a lot of Americans and Westerners don't understand. Is they think of like these massive ICBMs that are just so destructive that people don't use them precisely because of the concept of mutually assured destruction, right? But then there are these lower yield nuclear weapons that are designed to like take out smaller targets. I mean, they're still extremely destructive, but they're not like doomsday level destructive, right? And Russia has a massive arsenal of these tactical nuclear weapons that it would use if faced with, I mean, they've already said, if faced with an existential threat, we will use our nuclear arsenal. They have more of them than we do in Europe. And they've made it clear, like, and it makes sense from Russia's perspective. How else would they handle a unified NATO led by the United States going to war with them by itself? Nukes.
Yeah. And
that is being totally omitted from the discussion. I mean, you have some people that are actually honest and they're saying, well, it's worth it. Like Madeleine Albright moment, right? Nuclear war is worth democracy in Ukraine. There won't be anybody left alive in Ukraine, but there'll be democracy there, the smoldering ruins of democracy. So I think Biden is dovish, which I'm grateful for, but I think there are also people in the administration like Victoria who are extremely interventionist and are, I mean, these people, it's important to understand that these people like Nuland were instrumental in kind of taking the Obama administration and pushing it more in a liberal internationalist direction. There's debate over whether or not Obama would have done certain things on the foreign policy level were it not for the fact that you had people like Victoria Nuland working for him, who kind of hijacked his policy or nudged it in a certain direction. These people really are determined to get what they want, regardless of who the president is. That's actually a really useful way of looking at this. Like, again, Nuland has been, she served under Clinton, she served under W, she served under Obama, she served under Biden. All of these presidents and all these administrations have gone, but she and her friends have remained, and they have been really effective at getting their way, regardless of who's president, Republican or Democrat. And that's the really terrifying thing, is just in the same way that Zelensky is not fully in control, I think you could argue that Biden is not fully in control. Yeah. And that although he might actually be thank God, a restraining force, there are people within his administration who absolutely want to take us in the direction of war. And I don't think Biden, if Obama couldn't overcome these people, I think Biden's chances of doing it are not great, which is why in a really, I'm basically like the best possible outcome is that Putin and Zelensky actually come to an agreement and end up partitioning Ukraine. Basically, like the eastern parts of Ukraine end up becoming part of Russia, and then the western parts end up just, actually just remain part of or remain as Ukraine. I think that would actually be probably the best possible outcome and the only way to avoid, because the longer this conflict drags on, the more likely our intervention becomes.
Yeah, and there are just scary implications. Scary implications for that, for sure. Well, I appreciate your insight so much. Thanks for having the courage to ask a lot of the questions that people won't ask. I think it's a good reminder. I like this conversation because it's a reminder that this isn't essentially a left versus right thing. It's really not. It's about people who are seeking American interests and people who may possibly have interests beyond and outside of the United States. And I just appreciate how you are always interested in putting America first. So thanks for that. And thanks for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate the platform, and I'm sorry I couldn't go more into detail, but there's you could write a mini series on this stuff, and
maybe you should. Maybe that's your next project. Okay, thank you so much, Pedro.
Thank you.